Deep in the Montana wilderness, where pine trees stretch endlessly toward gray skies, a small cabin sat hidden from the world for over a decade. Inside, authorities discovered something that would haunt seasoned investigators for years to come. A young man, now 23, had spent most of his life chained to the walls of a single room. His parents, devout and terrified, believed their son carried a curse from the devil himself. Strange incidents had followed his birth. Objects moved without explanation. Animals fled his presence. Temperatures dropped when he cried. What began as religious fear had twisted into something darker, a prison built from love and terror in equal measure. When the truth finally emerged, it shattered a small community's understanding of faith, family, and the lengths people will go to protect what they believe is sacred. But was their son truly cursed, or was something else entirely at work in that isolated cabin? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Deputy Maria Martinez had been patrolling the mountain roads for 15 years, but she had never received a call quite like this one. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, when the first frost was already painting the pine needles silver. "We have an anonymous tip about a missing family," the voice said. "Caller claims to know the location of the Hartwells. Says they've been living in an isolated cabin for over a decade." The Hartwells. Martinez remembered the case from her early days on the force. A young family had simply vanished from Pine Ridge 23 years ago. Thomas Hartwell, a carpenter, Sarah, a schoolteacher, and their newborn son Daniel. No forwarding address, no contact with relatives. The case had gone cold faster than most missing person reports, mainly because there was no evidence of foul play. People assumed they had simply moved away for a fresh start. Martinez radioed for backup and began the 40-minute drive into the wilderness. The anonymous caller had provided remarkably detailed directions. Turn left at the lightning-struck oak. Follow the deer trail past the granite outcrop. Look for the cabin with the green metal roof, tucked into a grove of aspens near the creek. The forest grew denser as she climbed higher into the mountains. Her patrol car struggled on the narrow dirt roads, branches scraping against the windows. When the road finally ended, she continued on foot, following what could generously be called a trail. The silence was absolute, except for the crunch of her boots on fallen leaves and the distant sound of running water. After 20 minutes of hiking, she saw it. A small log cabin, weathered gray by decades of mountain storms, sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Smoke rose from a chimney, and she could see a garden plot recently harvested beside the front porch. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but something felt wrong. The windows were covered with thick curtains, blocking any view inside. No vehicles were visible, though she supposed they could have been parked deeper in the woods. The property felt abandoned despite the smoke from the chimney, as if whoever lived here was hiding from the world. Martinez approached the front door carefully, her hand resting on her service weapon. She could hear voices inside, low and urgent. A man's voice, then a woman's, both speaking in hushed tones. She knocked firmly on the wooden door. "Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to speak with the residents, please." The voices inside stopped abruptly. Martinez waited, counting the seconds. 30, 60. She knocked again, louder this time. "This is Deputy Martinez. I need to speak with Thomas and Sarah Hartwell." The silence stretched even longer. Then she heard the sound of multiple locks being undone, one after another. At least 4 deadbolts, maybe more. The door opened just a crack, held by a heavy chain. A woman's face appeared in the gap. She was perhaps 50 years old, with prematurely grey hair and eyes that darted nervously behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her skin had the pale, weathered look of someone who spent most of her time indoors. "We haven't done anything wrong," the woman said. "We just want to be left alone. Ma'am, I'm Sarah Hartwell. I just need to ask you a few questions. We received a report about your family." Sarah's eyes widened with panic. "Who called you?" "Nobody knows we're here. Nobody should know. Ma'am, if I could just come in for a few minutes. No. Sarah's voice was sharp. You can't come in. It's not safe. He's not well today. Behind Sarah, Martinez could hear another voice, deeper and more agitated. A man, presumably Thomas Hartwell, was speaking rapidly but quietly enough that she couldn't make out the words. Mrs. Hartwell, I understand you have concerns, but I need to verify that everyone in your household is safe and accounted for. The report mentioned your son Daniel. At the mention of Daniel's name, Sarah's face went completely white. She tried to close the door, but Martinez wedged her boot in the gap. Please, ma'am, I'm not here to cause trouble, but I do need to see that Daniel is safe. You don't understand, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. You can't see him. Not when he's like this. The things that happen when strangers come around. From somewhere deeper in the cabin, Martinez heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was a low, keening wail, like an animal in pain, but unmistakably human. The sound was followed by what sounded like chains rattling against wood. Sarah heard it too, and her eyes filled with tears. Please, she begged, just leave us be. We're managing. We're keeping everyone safe. But Martinez was already reaching for her radio, calling for immediate backup and medical assistance. Whatever was happening in this isolated cabin, it had been hidden from the world for far too long. Janet Coleman had seen enough broken families in her 25 years as a social worker to recognize the signs immediately. The way Sarah Hartwell's hands shook as she signed the emergency intake form. The hollow look in Thomas Hartwell's eyes as he sat hunched in the corner of the cabin's main room. The careful way they both avoided looking toward the closed door at the back of the single-room dwelling. But nothing had prepared her for what she found when that door finally opened. The room was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, with a single barred window that had been painted black from the inside. The walls were rough-hewn logs, and the floor was bare wood, worn smooth by years of pacing. In the center of the room, a young man sat on a narrow cot, heavy iron shackles around his ankles, connected to a chain that was bolted to the wall. Daniel Hartwell was 23 years old, though he looked both younger and older than his years. His body was thin, almost skeletal, with the pale complexion of someone who had seen little sunlight. His dark hair hung past his shoulders, unkempt and matted, but it was his eyes that haunted Janet the most. They were intelligent, alert, and filled with a profound sadness that no person should have to carry. When Janet entered the room, Daniel looked up at her with a mixture of curiosity and fear. He tried to stand, but the chains prevented him from rising fully. The sound of metal against wood echoed in the small space. "Hello, Daniel," Janet said softly, keeping her distance and her voice calm. "My name is Janet. I'm here to help you." Daniel tilted his head, studying her face as if trying to remember what a stranger looked like. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse. "Are you real or are you another dream?" The question broke Janet's heart. She knelt down slowly, several feet away from him, making herself less threatening. "I'm real, Daniel. I work for the county. We're here because we want to make sure you're safe and healthy." "Safe," Daniel repeated the word, as if testing its meaning. He glanced toward the door where his parents stood watching. "Mother says the chains keep everyone safe." From me, behind Janet, Sarah Hartwell spoke up, her voice defensive and desperate. "You don't understand what he's like. What happens when he gets upset? The things that move, the cold, the animals." Dr. Patricia Valdez, the emergency medical technician who had arrived with Janet, stepped forward with her medical bag. She was a small woman with kind eyes who specialized in trauma cases. "Daniel, would it be okay if I check to make sure you're not hurt anywhere?" Daniel looked to his parents for permission, a gesture so heartbreaking that Janet had to struggle to maintain her professional composure. After a long moment, Sarah nodded reluctantly. Dr. Valdez began her examination carefully, checking Daniel's pulse, blood pressure, and reflexes. She documented numerous issues in her notes: severe malnutrition, muscle atrophy from lack of exercise, vitamin D deficiency, pressure sores from the shackles, dental problems from years of poor nutrition. But what struck her most was Daniel's remarkable gentleness. Despite his physical condition, despite the obvious trauma of his situation, he was patient and cooperative. He apologized when he flinched during the examination. He thanked her quietly for being careful with his injuries. "Daniel," Janet said when the medical exam was complete, "can you tell me how long you've been living in this room?" Daniel looked confused by the question. "Living? I've always been here. Since I was small." He paused, seeming to search his memory. "I remember being outside once, I think. There were trees that were bigger than the cabin, and people who looked at me strangely. He was 7 when we brought him here, Thomas." Hartwell spoke for the first time since Janet had arrived. His voice was hollow, defeated. 7 years old when we realized what he was. What he could do. Janet turned to face the parents. "Mr. Hartwell, keeping a child chained is illegal, regardless of your beliefs about his condition. We need to get Daniel proper medical care and psychological evaluation." "You don't believe us about what he can do," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "But you'll see. When you take him away from here, when you put him around other people, you'll see what happens. The things that follow him." As if summoned by her words, a sudden wind rattled the cabin windows, though the day outside had been perfectly still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Janet noticed that her breath was suddenly visible in small puffs of vapor. Daniel noticed it too, and pulled his thin blanket more tightly around his shoulders. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm trying to keep it quiet, but sometimes it just happens." The wind died as suddenly as it had begun, and the temperature returned to normal. Janet looked around the room, searching for logical explanations. A broken window seal, perhaps? A draft from the chimney? But she had to admit that the timing was unsettling. "Regardless of any unusual circumstances," she said, her voice more steady than she felt, "Daniel needs proper care. Medical attention, nutrition, socialization. The law is clear about this." She began filling out the paperwork for emergency custody transfer while Dr. Valdez prepared Daniel for transport to the regional hospital. The young man cooperated with everything they asked, but Janet could see the terror in his eyes at the thought of leaving the only home he could remember. Dr. Elizabeth Ramos still kept the birth certificate in her office files. 23 years after that October night that changed everything for the Hartwell family. The yellow document bore unusual annotations in her careful handwriting, notes that she had never fully explained to anyone, not even her colleagues. "Delivery complicated by unexplained equipment failures," one note read. "Power fluctuations throughout labor. Backup generator failed twice." She remembered that night with the clarity that comes from witnessing something that defies medical explanation. Sarah Hartwell had arrived at Pine Ridge General Hospital in active labor, her husband Thomas gripping her hand and whispering prayers under his breath. It should have been a routine delivery. Sarah was healthy, 28 years old, and this was her first child. Everything about the pregnancy had been normal, but from the moment Sarah entered the delivery room, things began to go wrong. The first sign was the lights. They flickered constantly, dimming and brightening in a rhythm that seemed to match Sarah's contractions. The maintenance staff checked the electrical systems 3 times during the 12-hour labor, finding nothing wrong with the hospital's power grid. Then, the monitors began failing. The fetal heart monitor would work perfectly for minutes at a time, showing a strong, steady heartbeat, then suddenly display nothing but static. Dr. Ramos had delivered hundreds of babies, but she had never seen equipment malfunction so consistently without any technical explanation. The strangest thing, she had told her husband that night, was how cold the room became whenever Sarah's contractions intensified. The thermostats all read normal, but we could see our breath. The nurses kept bringing extra blankets. The delivery itself had been surprisingly easy, despite all the technical difficulties. Daniel had emerged healthy and alert, crying with impressive lung capacity. But the moment he was placed on his mother's chest, every piece of electronic equipment in the room went silent simultaneously. The lights, the monitors, even the digital clocks on the wall stopped working for exactly 3 minutes. When the power returned, the first thing anyone noticed was Sarah's expression. She was staring down at her newborn son with a look of absolute terror. "Something's wrong with him," she had whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can't you feel it?" "The cold?" Dr. Ramos had tried to reassure her. Postpartum anxiety was common, especially with first-time mothers. The equipment failures were unusual, but certainly not supernatural. There had to be logical explanations, but even she had to admit that the baby was different. Daniel was unusually quiet, rarely crying except during medical examinations. When he did cry, the temperature in whatever room he occupied seemed to drop noticeably. The hospital's maintenance staff received more service calls during Daniel's 5-day stay than they typically handled in a month. More troubling were the incidents with the other patients. Mrs. Henderson, in the adjoining room, complained that her television kept changing channels by itself. The woman in the bed across the hall insisted that someone kept moving her belongings, though the nursing staff swore they had touched nothing. 2 of the floor nurses requested transfers to different shifts, claiming they felt uneasy near the baby. Thomas Hartwell had tried to dismiss his wife's fears, but Dr. Ramos could see that he was troubled too. On the 3rd day, she found him standing in the hallway outside the maternity ward, staring through the window at his son in the nursery. "Doctor," he had said without turning around, "is it possible for a baby to be born with something wrong that doesn't show up on medical tests?" Dr. Ramos had assured him that Daniel was perfectly healthy according to every examination and blood test they had performed. But Thomas had shaken his head slowly. "I'm not talking about medical problems," he had said. "I'm talking about spiritual problems." The conversation had disturbed Dr. Ramos enough that she had made additional notes in Daniel's file, notes that went far beyond standard medical documentation. She recorded the equipment failures, the temperature fluctuations, and the unusual behavior of other patients. She also noted the parents' increasing anxiety and their repeated requests to leave the hospital early. On the day of discharge, Sarah had barely been able to look at her son. She held him stiffly, as if afraid he might burn her. Thomas carried the car seat and diaper bag, but his eyes kept darting to his wife and child with an expression of growing dread. "If you notice anything unusual," Dr. Ramos had told them, "anything at all that concerns you, please call immediately. We're here to help," but they never called. The family had simply vanished from Pine Ridge 6 months later, leaving no forwarding address and no contact information. Dr. Ramos had worried about them over the years, wondering if Sarah's postpartum anxiety had escalated into something more serious. Now, as she read the news reports about Daniel's rescue from the mountain cabin, she realized that Sarah's fears had indeed escalated into something far more tragic than she could have imagined. Margaret Foster had been running the Little Sprouts Daycare Center for 32 years when 4-year-old Daniel Hartwell first walked through her doors. She prided herself on creating a warm, nurturing environment where children could learn and grow. But Daniel was unlike any child she had ever encountered. It wasn't that he was disruptive or difficult. Quite the opposite, actually. Daniel was unusually quiet and well-behaved for a preschooler. He played by himself in the corner, building elaborate structures with blocks or drawing pictures that showed remarkable detail for his age. The other children seemed to gravitate toward him, drawn by his gentle nature and creative imagination. The problems began subtly. Margaret first noticed that the classroom aquarium, which had housed the same 3 goldfish for 2 years, became agitated whenever Daniel approached. The fish would swim frantically in circles, occasionally launching themselves partially out of the water as if trying to escape. She changed their food, adjusted the water temperature, and even consulted with a veterinarian, but the fish only behaved normally when Daniel was absent. Then there were the toys. Margaret would arrive each morning to find toys scattered across the floor, despite having cleaned and organized everything the evening before. At first, she assumed it was a security issue, but the building was always locked, and the alarm system showed no signs of intrusion. The mysterious disarray only occurred on days when Daniel was scheduled to attend. The temperature fluctuations were harder to dismiss. The thermostat in Daniel's classroom would inexplicably drop 15 to 20 degrees whenever he became upset or overly excited. Margaret called repair technicians 4 times in 2 months, but they could find nothing wrong with the heating system. The problem never occurred in other parts of the building. Most troubling were the incidents that the other teachers began reporting. Mrs. Chen, who taught the 5-year-olds next door, complained that her classroom supplies kept disappearing and reappearing in different locations. Scissors would vanish from her desk and turn up in the art supply closet. Books would be found open to different pages than where they had been left. The children in her class began asking if there was a ghost in the building. 5 months into the school year, Margaret decided she needed to have a conversation with Daniel's parents. She had always found Thomas and Sarah Hartwell to be devoted, attentive parents, though they seemed increasingly anxious each time they came to pick up their son. I wanted to discuss some concerns about Daniel's adjustment to the daycare environment, Margaret had said during their conference. Choosing her words carefully, Sarah had immediately tensed up. What kind of concerns? Is he misbehaving? Not at all. Daniel is a wonderful child. He's bright, creative, and very kind to the other children. But there have been some unusual incidents that seem to occur when he's here. Margaret explained about the aquarium, the temperature drops, and the mysteriously displaced objects. She watched as Sarah's face grew progressively paler and Thomas's jaw tightened with each detail. Have other parents complained? Thomas asked quietly. A few have mentioned that their children come home with stories about strange things happening at school. Nothing serious, just typical childhood imagination about ghosts and magic. But I thought you should be aware. The meeting had ended, with promises to monitor the situation more closely. But Margaret could tell that her concerns had deeply disturbed the Hartwells. Sarah had barely spoken during the remainder of the conference, and Thomas had asked several pointed questions about whether other staff members had noticed the same phenomena. 2 weeks later, the Hartwells withdrew Daniel from the daycare without explanation. Margaret tried calling to check on the family, but their phone had been disconnected. When she drove by their house, she found it empty with a "for sale" sign in the front yard. Neighbors told her the family had moved away suddenly, taking only a few belongings and leaving no forwarding address. The day after Daniel stopped coming to daycare, all the unusual incidents ceased immediately. The aquarium fish returned to their normal, placid behavior. The classroom temperature remained steady. No more objects were found out of place. But Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the fear she had seen in Sarah Hartwell's eyes during their conference. It was more than normal parental concern. It was the look of someone who recognized a pattern, someone who had seen these things before and understood what they meant. Years later, when she read about Daniel's rescue from the mountain cabin, Margaret realized that her innocent observations about classroom disturbances had probably contributed to his parents' decision to isolate him from the world. The guilt of that possibility would stay with her for the rest of her life. Reverend Marcus Reynolds had shepherded the Pine Ridge Baptist Church for 18 years when Thomas and Sarah Hartwell first came to him seeking guidance about their son. It was a cold February evening, and the couple had waited until the church was empty before approaching him in the sanctuary. Marcus could see the exhaustion in their faces immediately. Thomas, normally a sturdy, confident man who worked construction and coached Little League baseball, looked haggard and uncertain. Sarah, who had taught 3rd grade at the elementary school for 6 years, kept wringing her hands and glancing toward the church doors as if expecting someone to follow them. Pastor Reynolds, Thomas had begun, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk to you about our boy, about Daniel." Marcus had known Daniel since he was a toddler. The child came to Sunday school regularly, sat quietly during services, and seemed well adjusted, despite being unusually reserved for a 6-year-old. But he had noticed that the family often left immediately after services, rarely staying for fellowship or church activities. "Of course," Marcus had replied, gesturing toward the front pew. "What's troubling you about Daniel?" Sarah looked at her husband, tears already forming in her eyes. "Pastor, do you believe that children can be born with spiritual problems? Not medical problems, but something deeper." The question caught Marcus off guard. In his years of ministry, he had counseled families through many difficulties, but this felt different. There was a desperation in Sarah's voice that spoke of genuine terror. "Tell me what's been happening," Marcus said gently. The story that unfolded over the next hour challenged everything Marcus thought he understood about faith, family, and the nature of good and evil. Thomas and Sarah described years of increasingly disturbing incidents surrounding their son. Objects moving without explanation, dramatic temperature drops whenever Daniel became emotional, electronic devices failing in his presence, animals refusing to come near him. "It started at the hospital when he was born," Sarah explained. "The nurses thought it was funny at first, all the equipment acting up. But I knew something was wrong. I could feel it." Thomas picked up the narrative. "At home, it got worse. The baby monitor would just play static whenever we tried to use it in his room. The smoke detectors would go off for no reason. Our dog Rex, who loved everybody, would hide whenever Daniel cried. Have you consulted medical professionals?" Marcus asked, though he suspected they had exhausted those options. 3 pediatricians, a child psychologist, and a neurologist, Sarah replied. "They all say Daniel is perfectly healthy. Developmentally normal. No signs of any medical or psychological problems." Marcus studied the couple carefully. He had known them both for years. They were rational, educated people, not given to superstition or hysteria. Thomas was a deacon in the church, and Sarah taught Sunday school for the younger children. If they were reporting these incidents, he had to take them seriously. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. "We want you to pray over him," Thomas said. "We want you to bless him, or cleanse him, or whatever it takes to make this stop." Marcus felt the weight of their expectations settle on his shoulders. In seminary, they had taught him about counseling families in crisis, about offering comfort and guidance through Scripture. But nothing had prepared him for a situation like this. Over the following months, Marcus attempted several interventions. He visited the Hartwell home to pray with Daniel, though the sessions were consistently disrupted by power outages and unexplained cold drafts. He blessed the child with holy water and anointed him with oil, following traditional practices for spiritual cleansing. He organized prayer circles with other church members, asking for God's protection over the family. Nothing seemed to help. The incidents not only continued, but appeared to be escalating. During one particularly intense prayer session at the church, every window in the sanctuary cracked simultaneously while Daniel sat quietly in the front pew. The boy seemed unaware that anything unusual had happened, but the other church members began to whisper among themselves. Marcus found himself caught between his pastoral duty to help the family and his growing fear that he was dealing with something beyond his understanding. He began researching biblical accounts of demonic possession and spiritual warfare, areas of theology he had always considered more metaphorical than literal. The breaking point came during a Sunday morning service in late spring. Daniel had been sitting with his parents in their usual pew when the hymn books in the rack began falling to the floor one by one, despite no visible cause. Several congregation members noticed, and Marcus could see the fear and suspicion growing in their faces. After that service, Marcus made the most difficult decision of his ministerial career. He told the Hartwells that he believed their son needed help that went beyond what traditional church ministry could provide. He suggested they consider seeking guidance from specialists in spiritual warfare, or perhaps removing Daniel from situations where his presence might affect others. The family stopped coming to church 2 weeks later. The real estate listing had been simple enough: 43 acres of undeveloped mountain land, accessible only by logging roads with water rights from Clearwater Creek. No electricity, no phone lines, no neighbors within a 5-mile radius. For most buyers, the isolation would have been a drawback. For Thomas and Sarah Hartwell, it was exactly what they needed. They purchased the property in cash, using the money from the hasty sale of their Pine Ridge home. Thomas had liquidated his construction business, sold his tools and equipment, and withdrawn their modest savings account. Sarah had resigned from her teaching position without explanation, forfeiting her pension contributions and tenure. The decision to leave civilization had not been made lightly. After the incident at church, after Pastor Reynolds had essentially given up on helping Daniel, the couple had spent weeks agonizing over their options. They could continue trying to live in normal society, watching their 7-year-old son inadvertently terrify everyone around him. They could seek help from specialists who would likely dismiss their concerns, or worse, separate their family. Or they could remove Daniel from society entirely, protecting both him and everyone else from whatever force seemed to follow him. "We're not abandoning him," Sarah had said during one of their late-night discussions. "We're saving him. And we're saving other people from what he brings," Thomas had nodded grimly. "Maybe if we get him away from all the distractions, all the people and electronics and chaos, maybe whatever this is will calm down. Maybe he'll get better." They spent the summer before Daniel's 8th birthday building their new home. Thomas had construction experience, but building a cabin in the wilderness presented challenges he had never faced. Every piece of lumber, every tool, every bag of nails had to be hauled in by hand or with the help of an old pickup truck that barely made it up the mountain roads. Daniel helped as much as a young boy could, carrying small items and watching his father work. He seemed to enjoy the isolation, the quiet of the forest, the simple rhythm of physical labor. For brief periods, Thomas allowed himself to hope that their plan might actually work. The cabin was modest but functional. One large main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living area. A small bedroom for Thomas and Sarah, and a separate room for Daniel, built with extra thick walls and a single small window. Sarah had insisted on the design of Daniel's room from the beginning. "He needs his own space," she had explained when Thomas questioned the heavy construction. "Somewhere he can go when the episodes get bad. Somewhere that will contain whatever happens." Thomas had understood her logic, even if he didn't want to admit it. The incidents had not stopped during their months of isolation. If anything, they seemed to be intensifying as Daniel grew older. Tools would disappear from Thomas's worksite, only to reappear days later in impossible locations. The truck's engine would die inexplicably whenever Daniel rode in it, then start perfectly when he wasn't present. Their camping gear would be scattered around their temporary shelter each morning, despite being securely stored the night before. By autumn, the cabin was complete, and the family had officially severed their last ties to the outside world. They had no mailing address, no telephone, no electricity, beyond what a small generator could provide. Their nearest neighbor was a hunting lodge 5 miles down the mountain, and it was only occupied a few weeks each year. Daniel seemed to adapt well to their new life initially. He explored the forest, learned to identify animal tracks and edible plants, and helped his mother tend a small garden. For the first few months, the supernatural incidents decreased in frequency and intensity, but as winter approached and the family spent more time confined indoors, the old patterns began to reassert themselves. The generator would fail during Daniel's emotional outbursts. Their food supplies would be mysteriously disturbed. The cabin's temperature would plummet without warning. Most disturbing of all, Daniel began talking to someone who wasn't there. Sarah would find him having animated conversations with an invisible companion, discussing topics that seemed far too sophisticated for an 8-year-old child. "Who are you talking to?" she asked him one evening. Daniel looked at her with surprise. "The Shadow Man. He lives in the walls. He tells me stories about people who used to live here." When Thomas investigated, he found old survey maps that indicated several homesteads had been built on their property over the past century. All had been abandoned under mysterious circumstances. That night, lying in their bed listening to strange sounds from Daniel's room, Sarah whispered to her husband, "What if we didn't bring him here to protect other people? What if we brought him here to feed whatever was already waiting?" Thomas Hartwell had never imagined he would use his carpentry skills to forge chains for his own son. But by Daniel's 9th birthday, he could no longer deny that containment was their only option. The incident that changed everything had occurred on a February morning when Daniel was helping his mother prepare breakfast. Sarah was cooking eggs on their wood-burning stove when Daniel became frustrated trying to reach a dish from a high shelf. His sudden burst of anger had caused every piece of metal in the cabin to vibrate simultaneously. The cast-iron skillet flew off the stove, splashing hot grease across Sarah's arm and leaving a burn that would scar her for life. But it wasn't just the physical injury that terrified them. It was the look on Daniel's face immediately afterward. For just a moment, something else had looked out through his eyes. Something ancient and malevolent that recognized what it had done and was pleased by it. "I'm sorry, Mama," Daniel had whispered, his voice returning to that of a frightened 9-year-old. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I never mean to hurt anyone." That night, after Sarah's burn had been bandaged with their limited medical supplies, Thomas had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Using his forge and metalworking tools, he began crafting a set of restraints designed to keep his son confined to a single room. The shackles were not made in cruelty. Thomas spent weeks designing them to be as comfortable as possible while still being effective. He padded the interior with soft leather, ensuring they wouldn't cut into Daniel's skin. He made them adjustable so they could accommodate his son's growth. The chain was long enough to allow movement around the small room, but not long enough to reach the door. "This is temporary," Thomas told Sarah as he installed the heavy bolts that would anchor the chain to the cabin's strongest wall. "Just until we can figure out how to help him. Just until whatever's inside him calms down." Sarah had wept as she watched her husband work, but she didn't protest. The burn on her arm throbbed constantly, a reminder of how dangerous their son had become, despite his gentle nature. When they first put the shackles on Daniel, he had accepted them with heartbreaking resignation. He was old enough to understand that he had hurt his mother, old enough to feel the weight of guilt, even though the incident had been beyond his conscious control. "Am I bad, Papa?" he had asked as Thomas fitted the leather-padded iron around his small ankles. "No, son," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not bad. You're sick, and we're going to take care of you until you get better." But Daniel didn't get better. If anything, his confinement seemed to intensify whatever force surrounded him. The temperature in his room would drop so low that ice would form on the inside of the single window. Objects in the main cabin would move on their own, drawn toward Daniel's room, as if by some invisible magnetism. The walls themselves would creak and groan, as if the cabin were being slowly twisted by an enormous unseen hand. Meals became a daily ordeal. Sarah would prepare Daniel's food and slide it through a slot Thomas had cut in the door. Sometimes Daniel would eat normally, thanking his parents politely and asking about their day. Other times, the food would be flung against the walls by invisible hands, while Daniel sat quietly in the corner, tears streaming down his face as he apologized for something he couldn't control. The worst moments were when Daniel would speak in voices that weren't his own. Sometimes it was the voice of an old woman, speaking in a dialect none of them recognized. Sometimes it was multiple voices speaking simultaneously, creating a horrible chorus that made their skin crawl. During these episodes, Daniel's eyes would go completely black, and he would relay information about people and events he couldn't possibly know. "The woman who lived here before had 3 children, he said in an elderly man's voice during one such episode. "She buried them by the creek when the fever took them. They're still there, waiting." Thomas had found the small cemetery exactly where Daniel described it, hidden beneath decades of forest growth. 3 tiny headstones, worn smooth by weather, marking the graves of children who had died over a century ago. As the years passed, the chains became as much a part of Daniel's existence as eating or sleeping. He learned to move within their constraints, to sleep despite the weight of the shackles, to find small comforts within his confined world. And Thomas learned to live with the knowledge that he had caged his own child, not out of cruelty, but out of a desperate love that had found no other expression in a situation that defied all rational understanding. Sarah Hartwell's prayer diary became her lifeline to sanity during the long years of isolation. Every night, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, she would record the day's events in careful handwriting, seeking patterns in the chaos that had consumed their lives. March 15th read one entry from Daniel's 13th year. The wooden spoons in the kitchen drawer arranged themselves in a perfect circle while I was tending the garden. When I came inside, they were standing upright like soldiers. Daniel was sleeping when it happened. He couldn't have done it consciously. Her entries grew more detailed as the phenomena intensified with Daniel's adolescence. She documented temperature readings, noting that Daniel's room would drop to nearly freezing even when the main cabin remained comfortable. She recorded the positions of objects that moved on their own, trying to discern if there was any meaning to their new arrangements. March 22nd. All the nails in Thomas's toolbox pulled themselves out and formed a spiral pattern on his workbench. Daniel says the Shadow Man is teaching him about sacred geometry. I don't understand what that means, but it frightens me. The Shadow Man had become a constant presence in Daniel's conversations. According to their son, this entity had been trapped beneath their property for generations, growing stronger as each family that had lived there provided him with emotional energy through their fear and desperation. He's not bad. Mama, Daniel would explain during their daily conversations through the slot in his door. He's just hungry, and he's been hungry for a very long time. Sarah's diary entries revealed her growing understanding that they were not dealing with demonic possession in any traditional sense. This was something older, more primal, that fed on human emotion and used Daniel as a conduit between the spiritual and physical worlds. April 3rd. Daniel levitated 3 feet off his bed for nearly 10 minutes today. He was completely relaxed, almost peaceful. When I asked him about it later, he said the Shadow Man was showing him how to float like the children who died here long ago. The most disturbing entries dealt with Daniel's growing knowledge of things he couldn't possibly know. Through whatever connection he maintained with the entity, he could describe events happening miles away from their isolated cabin. He told his parents about forest fires before the smoke became visible, about traffic accidents on distant highways, about deaths in the town they had abandoned years before. April 18th, Daniel knew about Mrs. Henderson's death before we could have heard about it through any normal means. He described her final moments in the hospital in precise detail. He said she wasn't alone, that all the people who had died on this mountain came to help her cross over, but perhaps the most heartbreaking entries were those that revealed Sarah's internal struggle between her maternal love and her growing belief that her son was beyond human help. May 1st, I dream sometimes of the boy Daniel might have been if we had stayed in town. Would he have played baseball like Thomas wanted? Would he have learned to drive, gone to college, fallen in love? Instead, he speaks to the dead and moves objects with his mind. Is this punishment for some sin I committed? Or is this simply the burden God has chosen for our family? As Daniel entered his late teens, the supernatural activity reached levels that defied any attempt at documentation. Entire sections of Sarah's diary were written in handwriting that wasn't hers, penned by her own hand, but dictated by voices she couldn't identify. "The boy is a bridge," read one such passage, "between what was, what is, and what will be. Through him we who are forgotten remember. Through him we who are lost find our way. He is not cursed. He is blessed with sight beyond the veil." The final entries in Sarah's diary, written in her own shaky handwriting during Daniel's 23rd year, revealed a woman at the breaking point of sanity and endurance. "I can't do this anymore. Thomas is talking about ending it all. about freeing Daniel from whatever holds him. But how do you kill your own child? How do you destroy the thing you love most in the world to save him from a fate you don't understand? The Shadow Man promises that Daniel will be free someday, that someone will come who understands what he truly is. But I've been waiting 16 years for that someone, and they never come. We're all prisoners here, Daniel in his chains, and Thomas and I in our guilt and fear. The last entry was dated 3 days before Deputy Martinez received the anonymous tip that would lead to Daniel's rescue. God forgive us for what we've done to our boy. God forgive us for what we're about to do. Janet Coleman had never forgotten the Hartwell family, even 23 years after they vanished from Pine Ridge. As a young social worker fresh out of graduate school, she had encountered the family briefly when Daniel was still attending daycare. Their sudden disappearance had troubled her enough that she kept their file active long after her supervisors suggested closing it. Over the years, she had built a reputation as someone who never gave up on missing children. Her office walls were covered with photographs and newspaper clippings of cases she had helped resolve. But the faded missing person flyer for the Hartwell family remained prominently displayed on her desk. Baby Daniel would be 23 now, she would tell her colleagues whenever anyone suggested finally closing the file. Same age as my nephew. He's out there somewhere. What kept Janet motivated was her memory of Sarah Hartwell during their single meeting. The woman had been desperately seeking help for her son's developmental concerns, though Janet had noted at the time that Daniel appeared to be a normal, healthy 4-year-old. There had been something in Sarah's eyes, however, something that spoke of deeper fears than typical parental anxiety. She was terrified of her own child, Janet had written in her notes back then. Not angry, not frustrated, but genuinely frightened. This deserves follow-up, but before Janet could schedule a home visit, the family had vanished. Her investigation over the years had uncovered fragments of information that painted a disturbing picture. She had interviewed Margaret Foster from the daycare, who described unexplained phenomena surrounding Daniel. She had spoken with Pastor Reynolds, who reluctantly admitted that the family had sought spiritual counseling before disappearing. She had even tracked down Dr. Elizabeth Ramos, who confirmed unusual incidents during Daniel's birth. Everyone who encountered this family remembered them, Janet noted in her case files. But no one wanted to talk about why. The breakthrough came when Janet received a call from a retired forest ranger named William Crenshaw. At 78, Crenshaw was dealing with failing health and wanted to clear his conscience about something he had witnessed years earlier. I saw them, he told Janet during their meeting at his assisted living facility. The Hartwell family. They built a cabin up on Clearwater Creek, maybe 15 years ago. I was patrolling the area for illegal hunting when I spotted smoke from their chimney. Crenshaw explained that he had observed the family from a distance on several occasions, noting their isolation and self-sufficiency. But what troubled him most was what he had witnessed during his final encounter with them. I was checking trail conditions after a winter storm when I heard screaming coming from their cabin. Not normal screaming, mind you, something that made my blood run cold. When I got closer, I could see through their window. There was a young man, maybe teenager at the time, chained to the wall like an animal. The ranger had debated reporting what he saw, but the family had been living peacefully on their own land, and he wasn't certain what he had witnessed. Mountain folk are different, he said. They handle problems their own way. I figured maybe the boy was dangerous. Maybe they were protecting themselves. But as the years passed and Crenshaw's health declined, he realized he might have made a terrible mistake by staying silent. That boy would be a man now, he told Janet. If he's still alive up there, if they're still keeping him chained, then I've been complicit in something awful for 16 years. Janet immediately began preparing for an investigation. She contacted the sheriff's department, requesting a welfare check on the remote property. She gathered all her old files on the Hartwell case, preparing evidence of their disappearance and the concerning circumstances surrounding it. But she also began preparing for what she might find. A man who had spent most of his life in isolation and captivity would require specialized care and rehabilitation. She contacted colleagues who specialized in trauma recovery, researched facilities that might be equipped to handle such an extreme case. Most importantly, she tried to prepare herself emotionally for the possibility that Daniel Hartwell might no longer be the gentle 4-year-old she remembered from her brief encounter with his family. After 23 years of isolation, she wrote in her final case note before the rescue, "We have no way of knowing what we'll find up there, but that little boy deserves a chance at freedom, regardless of what his captivity may have done to him." The anonymous tip that finally led to Daniel's discovery came just 3 days after Janet's conversation with Ranger Crenshaw. She never learned who had written the letter to the sheriff's department, but she suspected it had come from someone else who had been carrying the weight of knowledge and guilt for far too long. In the darkness of his confined world, Daniel Hartwell had learned to create light with his imagination. Over the 16 years of his captivity, he had developed an intricate mental landscape where he could escape the weight of chains and the cold stone walls that surrounded him. His most treasured possessions were the small wooden birds he carved from splinters and scraps that fell from the cabin's log walls. Using nothing but his fingernails and small stones, he had crafted dozens of these tiny creatures over the years, each one representing a different aspect of freedom he could only dream about. The first bird had been a simple robin, carved when he was 11 years old, and still believed his confinement was temporary. He had remembered seeing robins outside his window during their first spring at the cabin, before his father had painted the glass black to block his view of the outside world. The wooden robin was crude and imperfect, but it represented his first act of creative rebellion against his circumstances. Over time, his carving skills improved dramatically. He created hawks with outstretched wings, owls with intricate feather patterns, and songbirds so delicate they seemed ready to take flight. Each bird was hidden carefully in the cracks between the log walls, a secret collection that his parents never discovered. "Tell me about the outside world," Daniel would whisper to his wooden companions during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. In his mind, they would respond with stories of soaring above mountain peaks, of building nests in tall trees, of migrating thousands of miles to places where the sun always shone. The Shadow Man, the entity that had haunted Daniel's family for so many years, had gradually become less of a frightening presence and more of a strange companion. Through their conversations, Daniel learned that the being was as trapped as he was, bound to the property by circumstances that predated human memory. "We are both prisoners," the Shadow Man would tell him during their late-night discussions. "But prisoners can sometimes free each other." Through this supernatural connection, Daniel experienced fragments of life beyond his prison. He would close his eyes and suddenly find himself soaring with eagles over the mountain ranges, or swimming with fish in the clear streams that flowed down from the peaks. These experiences were more than dreams, more vivid and detailed than anything his imagination could create alone. During one such vision, he found himself walking through a bustling town, watching people go about their daily lives. Children played in parks, couples held hands as they walked down busy streets, families gathered around dinner tables filled with laughter and conversation. The normalcy of it all filled him with a profound longing that sometimes left him sobbing for hours after the vision ended. But Daniel also used these mental escapes to educate himself. Through the Shadow Man's ancient memories, he learned about history, science, literature, and art. He discovered mathematical concepts by studying the geometric patterns that appeared in his room during supernatural manifestations. He developed an understanding of human nature by observing the emotional states that triggered the paranormal activity around him. His parents never realized that their chained son had become far more educated than most people his age. Despite never attending school or reading a single book, the wooden birds served as his teachers as well. Each carving required him to study anatomy, to understand how wings worked, how feathers layered to create the perfect surface for flight. He memorized the migration patterns of dozens of species, learned to identify birds by their songs, even though he heard them only in his memories. Someday, he would tell his carved companions, "I'll see real birds again. And when I do, I'll know each of you personally." Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Daniel's mental survival was his capacity for forgiveness. Despite 16 years of captivity, despite the chains that left permanent scars on his ankles, despite being cut off from human society during the most formative years of his life, he never allowed hatred to take root in his heart. He understood, in ways that defied his limited experience, that his parents believed they were protecting both him and the world from something dangerous. He could feel their love even through the locked door, could sense their anguish each time they brought him meals, or listened to him moving around his confined space. "They're as trapped as I am," he would explain to the Shadow Man during their philosophical discussions. Fear is just another kind of prison. As Daniel approached his 23rd birthday, something began to shift in the supernatural energy that surrounded him. The Shadow Man spoke more frequently of change coming, of someone who would finally understand what Daniel truly was. "Freedom is coming," the entity whispered during one of their final conversations. "Are you ready to spread your wings?" Thomas Hartwell had been contemplating suicide for 3 months before he finally found the courage to write the letter. The decision hadn't come suddenly, but had grown like a cancer in his mind, fed by 16 years of guilt, exhaustion, and the increasing weight of what he and Sarah had done to their son. The final straw had come during a conversation with Daniel through the slot in his door. His son, now 23 years old, and possessing a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years of isolation, had asked a question that shattered Thomas's remaining defenses. "Papa, are you happy with the life you've chosen for us?" Thomas had been unable to answer. How could he explain that he had never chosen this life, that it had been forced upon them by circumstances beyond their understanding? How could he tell his son that every day of the past 16 years had been a form of slow torture for all 3 of them? That night, Thomas sat at the rough wooden table he had built during their first year in the cabin and began writing what he knew would be his final letter to the outside world. His handwriting was shaky from years of isolation and the emotional weight of his decision, but his words were clear and purposeful. "To whoever finds this letter," he began, "my name is Thomas Hartwell, and I've committed a terrible crime against my own son. For 16 years, my wife Sarah and I have kept our boy Daniel chained in this cabin, believing we were protecting him and the world from forces we didn't understand." He wrote for hours, documenting the supernatural incidents that had driven their family to isolation, describing Daniel's condition and location, providing detailed directions to the cabin. He explained their motivations, not to excuse their actions, but to help whoever found Daniel understand the complex circumstances that had led to his captivity. "Daniel is not dangerous in the way most people would understand," Thomas continued. "He is gentle, intelligent, and possesses a capacity for forgiveness that humbles me. But there are forces around him, supernatural phenomena that have followed him since birth. We convinced ourselves that keeping him isolated was the only way to protect everyone." The letter revealed Thomas's growing understanding that they had been wrong, that their fear had transformed love into cruelty, protection into imprisonment. "I see now that we robbed our son of his life based on our own terror and superstition. We denied him education, friendship, love, and the basic human right to make his own choices. We told ourselves we were saving him, but we were only saving ourselves from having to face the unknown." Thomas described Daniel's remarkable resilience, his artistic abilities, his supernatural education through whatever entity haunted their property. He painted a picture of a young man who had somehow maintained his humanity despite being treated like a dangerous animal for most of his life. If you can help Daniel integrate into normal society, please do so with patience and understanding. He has never used a telephone, never driven a car, never been to school or held a job. But he is brilliant, kind, and capable of adapting to anything if given the chance. The most difficult part of the letter dealt with Sarah's deteriorating mental state. After 16 years of isolation and guilt, she had begun showing signs of severe psychological breakdown. She spoke to invisible people, forgot basic details about their situation, and sometimes didn't recognize Thomas or Daniel for hours at a time. "My wife needs psychiatric help," Thomas wrote. "She is not evil, just broken by years of carrying an impossible burden. Please treat her with compassion when you find her." As dawn approached, Thomas sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote careful directions to the cabin on the outside. He had already decided how he would deliver it. The old logging road that passed 3 miles from their property was occasionally used by Forest Service vehicles. He would walk down and leave the letter where it would eventually be found. But first, he needed to say goodbye to Daniel. "Son," he said through the door slot, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that everything your mother and I did was because we love you. We made terrible mistakes, but they came from love." Daniel's response nearly broke his resolve. "I know, Papa, I've always known. And I forgive you for everything." Thomas left the cabin that morning carrying the letter and a length of rope. He posted the letter at the logging road, then walked deeper into the forest to a place where Sarah and Daniel would never find him. His body was discovered 2 days later by the same Forest Service patrol that found his letter. But by then, Deputy Martinez was already on her way up the mountain, following the directions Thomas had provided with his final act of love for his son, Forest Service Ranger Patricia. Wells had been patrolling the Clearwater Creek logging road for routine maintenance when she spotted the envelope tucked beneath a rock at the intersection of 2 timber trails. The white paper stood out starkly against the brown earth and fallen leaves, obviously placed there deliberately for someone to find. The envelope was addressed simply to the authorities in shaky handwriting. Patricia hesitated before opening it, wondering if she was about to become involved in some kind of domestic dispute or property boundary disagreement. Mountain folk occasionally used unconventional methods to communicate with government agencies. What she read in Thomas Hartwell's confession letter made her hands tremble. "My God," she whispered to herself, reading the detailed description of a young man who had been held captive for 16 years. The letter included precise GPS coordinates and a hand-drawn map showing the location of a remote cabin where, according to the writer, his son Daniel was being held in chains. Patricia immediately radioed her supervisor, who contacted the Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department. Within 2 hours, she found herself leading Deputy Martinez and a small team of emergency responders up the mountain trail toward the coordinates Thomas had provided. The anonymity of the letter troubled everyone involved. Thomas had signed his name, but provided no context for how or why he had delivered the information. The confession read like a suicide note, which added urgency to their mission. "We need to treat this as both a rescue operation and a potential crime scene," Deputy Martinez told the team as they hiked through the dense forest. "We don't know what we're walking into up there." The trail was more difficult than Patricia had expected. What appeared on maps as a simple logging road had been reclaimed by nature over the years. Fallen trees blocked their path in several places, and the narrow creek crossings were treacherous with autumn rain runoff as they climbed higher into the mountains. Patricia began to notice subtle signs that someone had been living in the area for a long time. Old cut marks on trees where firewood had been harvested, worn paths leading away from the main trail. A small garden plot, recently harvested but obviously well maintained over many seasons. "Someone's definitely been up here," she told Deputy Martinez as they paused to examine what appeared to be a root cellar dug into a hillside. "And they've been here for years." The cabin came into view exactly where Thomas's map indicated it would be. Smoke rose from the chimney, and they could see a vegetable garden and a small shed behind the main structure. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic, nestled in a grove of aspens near the creek. But Patricia noticed immediately that something was wrong. The windows were covered with heavy curtains or painted black, blocking any view inside. No one came out to greet them, despite the obvious sound of their approach through the forest. Deputy Martinez took the lead as they approached the front door. The rest of the team spread out around the perimeter of the cabin, prepared for any eventuality. Patricia stayed close to the deputy, her radio ready to call for additional backup if needed. When Martinez knocked on the door and identified herself, the response from inside was immediate panic. A woman's voice, high and frightened, begging them to leave. A man's voice in the background, though Patricia realized from the confession letter that Thomas Hartwell was likely already dead. But it was the sound that came from deeper within the cabin that confirmed their worst fears. A low, keening wail that was unmistakably human, followed by the metallic rattle of chains against wood. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the EMTs. "There really is someone chained up in there." Patricia watched as Deputy Martinez tried to negotiate with the woman inside, presumably Sarah Hartwell. The conversation was surreal, with Sarah alternately begging them to leave and warning them about supernatural dangers they wouldn't understand. When they finally gained entry to the cabin, Patricia was struck by how normal the main living area appeared. Neat and clean, with handmade furniture and carefully tended houseplants. It looked like the home of people who had chosen a simple, self-sufficient lifestyle in the mountains, but the locked door at the back of the room told a different story entirely. When that door opened and Patricia saw Daniel Hartwell for the first time, chained to the wall like an animal, she understood that she was witnessing one of the most tragic cases of family dysfunction in her 30 years of public service. The young man looked up at them with intelligent, curious eyes, as if he had been expecting their arrival. When he spoke, his first words were not a plea for help or a cry of relief. Instead, he looked directly at Deputy Martinez and said quietly, "Thank you for coming. My father said you would find his letter." Dr. Sarah Kim had treated thousands of patients during her 15 years in emergency medicine. But nothing had prepared her for the young man who arrived at Pine Ridge General Hospital that October evening. The preliminary report from the rescue team had described severe malnutrition and possible psychological trauma. But the reality was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. Daniel Hartwell sat quietly on the examination table, his ankles still bearing the raw marks from 16 years of shackles. He was painfully thin, his skin pale from lack of sunlight, and his muscles had atrophied from years of limited movement. But what struck Dr. Kim most profoundly was his remarkable composure and intelligence. "Can you tell me your name?" she asked gently, beginning her standard neurological assessment. "Daniel Thomas Hartwell," he replied clearly. "I'm 23 years old, and I've been living in the mountains with my parents since I was 7. His speech patterns were formal, almost old-fashioned, as if he had learned to talk from books rather than conversation. But his vocabulary was extensive, and he showed no signs of the developmental delays that Dr. Kim had expected after so many years of isolation. "Daniel, I need to examine you to make sure you're not seriously injured. Is that okay with you?" He nodded solemnly. "The lady at the cabin, Miss Janet, explained that you would need to check my health. I understand that this is necessary." As Dr. Kim conducted her examination, she documented a litany of physical problems that would require months of treatment. Severe vitamin D deficiency had left his bones brittle and his teeth in poor condition. Muscle wasting was evident throughout his body, particularly in his legs where the shackles had restricted movement. Pressure sores on his ankles had become infected despite his parents' apparent attempts to keep them clean, but perhaps most concerning was his cardiovascular system. Years of limited physical activity had left his heart dangerously weakened, and his blood pressure was critically low. Dr. Kim immediately ordered IV fluids and began planning a comprehensive rehabilitation program. "Daniel, when was the last time you saw a doctor?" she asked while reviewing his blood work results. "I've never seen a doctor," he replied matter-of-factly. "My parents treated my injuries when they happened. My mother was very good at bandaging cuts and burns. The blood tests revealed alarming deficiencies in almost every essential vitamin and mineral. His iron levels were so low that Dr. Kim was surprised he remained conscious. His immune system was compromised to the point where a simple cold could have been life-threatening. Yet despite his physical condition, Daniel demonstrated remarkable mental acuity. When Dr. Kim asked him basic questions to assess his cognitive function, he provided answers that revealed an education far beyond what anyone could have expected. "Can you tell me what year it is?" she asked. "Based on the calendar my parents kept, it should be 2024, Daniel replied. "Though I understand that my knowledge of current events is quite limited. How did you learn to speak so well if you've been isolated for 16 years? Daniel considered the question carefully. "I had teachers," he said finally. "Not human teachers, but I learned many things during my time in the cabin. Mathematics, history, literature, science. The Shadow Man was very knowledgeable about human civilization. Dr. Kim made a note to have Daniel evaluated by a psychiatrist concerned about possible dissociative disorders or hallucinations, but his responses were too coherent and detailed to dismiss as simple delusions." As the evening progressed, word spread through the hospital about the unusual patient in the emergency department. Nurses and staff members found excuses to walk past his room, curious about the young man who had been held captive for most of his life. What surprised everyone was Daniel's reaction to the modern hospital environment. Rather than being overwhelmed or frightened by the electronic equipment, fluorescent lighting, and constant activity, he seemed fascinated and delighted by everything he observed. "The lights don't flicker here," he commented to Dr. Kim with obvious pleasure, "and the machines work properly. It's been many years since I've seen technology function the way it's supposed to." The comment puzzled Dr. Kim until she read Janet Coleman's preliminary report about the supernatural phenomena that had allegedly surrounded Daniel's captivity. She made another note for the psychiatric evaluation, though she had to admit that Daniel's behavior was remarkably stable for someone who claimed to have experienced paranormal activity for 16 years. The most touching moment of the examination came when Daniel asked his first question about the outside world. "Doctor, are there still birds that fly freely in the sky? I carved many birds during my time in the cabin, and I've always hoped to see real ones again." Dr. Kim assured him that there were indeed birds everywhere and promised that he would see them soon. The joy that lit up Daniel's face at this simple confirmation made her realize that despite everything he had endured, the essential humanity within him had somehow survived intact. Dr. Michael Torres had built his reputation as a paranormal investigator on scientific rigor rather than sensationalism. When the Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Department contacted him about the unusual circumstances surrounding Daniel Hartwell's rescue, he approached the case with his typical methodical skepticism. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence," he told Sheriff Williams during their initial phone conversation. "But I've learned not to dismiss anything until I've had a chance to examine it personally." Dr. Torres arrived at the Hartwell cabin 3 days after Daniel's rescue, accompanied by a team of graduate students and a van full of sophisticated monitoring equipment. His goal was to document and explain the supernatural phenomena that had allegedly driven the family to such extreme measures. The cabin itself felt ordinary when they first entered. It was neat, well-maintained, and showed clear signs of a family that had lived there for many years. But as Torres began setting up his electromagnetic field detectors and thermal imaging cameras, he noticed subtle anomalies that couldn't be immediately explained. "The baseline electromagnetic readings are unusual," reported Jennifer Walsh, one of his graduate assistants. We're getting fluctuations that don't match any known source of interference. Torres nodded, making notes in his field journal. He had investigated hundreds of allegedly haunted locations over his 20-year career, and most could be explained by faulty wiring, underground water sources, or simple human psychology. But the readings at the Hartwell cabin were genuinely puzzling. The temperature variations were even more intriguing. Using thermal imaging equipment, Torres documented cold spots throughout the cabin that defied conventional explanation. The most dramatic temperature drop occurred in Daniel's former room, where readings consistently measured 15 to 20 degrees below the ambient temperature in the rest of the building. There's no drafts, no broken windows, no obvious source for these thermal anomalies, Torres dictated into his recorder. The cold spots seemed to be generated from within the room itself. But the real breakthrough came when Torres began researching the geological history of the property. County records indicated that the Hartwell cabin sat directly above a complex network of underground caves and mineral deposits. More importantly, geological surveys showed high concentrations of magnetite and quartz formations beneath the property. This is significant, Torres explained to Sheriff Williams during a briefing at the end of his first day. Magnetite can create powerful electromagnetic fields, especially when combined with underground water sources. The quartz formations can amplify these effects, creating what geologists call a natural electromagnetic anomaly zone. Further investigation revealed that the property had a long history of unexplained incidents. Torres discovered records dating back over a century, documenting families who had attempted to settle in the area but abandoned their homesteads after reporting strange phenomena. Native American oral histories from the region described the location as a place where the spirits of the earth speak loudly. What we're dealing with here isn't supernatural in the traditional sense, Torres concluded after a week of intensive investigation. It's a naturally occurring phenomenon that creates the perfect conditions for what people interpret as paranormal activity, the electromagnetic fields generated by the underground. Mineral deposits could affect sensitive individuals in various ways. Some people experienced hallucinations, others felt temperature changes, and a few reported seeing objects move without apparent cause. The fields were strong enough to interfere with electronic equipment, causing the power fluctuations and equipment failures that had plagued Daniel's family since his birth. But Torres discovered something even more remarkable when he examined Daniel's blood samples, which had been saved from his initial medical evaluation. The young man's body showed unusual levels of iron and other minerals, suggesting that he had somehow adapted to living within the electromagnetic field over many years. Daniel appears to have developed a unique sensitivity to these natural forces, Torres explained to Dr. Kim during a consultation at the hospital. His body chemistry has adjusted to the electromagnetic environment, making him essentially a human conductor for the geological phenomena. This explained why the supernatural incidents had seemed to center around Daniel throughout his life. He wasn't causing the phenomena, but rather amplifying and focusing the natural, electromagnetic disturbances through his physical presence. The tragedy is that his parents interpreted a natural phenomenon as something demonic, Torres said sadly. They spent 16 years trying to contain something that was actually part of the Earth's natural processes. Torres's final report provided scientific explanations for every supernatural incident the Hartwell family had experienced. The moving objects were caused by electromagnetic pulses strong enough to affect metal items. The temperature drops resulted from the interaction between the underground mineral deposits and atmospheric conditions. Even Daniel's apparent psychic abilities could be explained by his heightened sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, which allowed him to perceive information in ways that seemed supernatural but were actually based in physics. The real miracle, Torres concluded, isn't that Daniel experienced paranormal phenomena. It's that he survived 16 years of isolation with his sanity and humanity intact. The courtroom in Pine Ridge County was packed beyond capacity on the morning Sarah Hartwell's trial began. Media crews from 3 states had descended on the small mountain town, drawn by the sensational story of a young man held captive by his own parents for 16 years. But for those who knew the family before their disappearance, the proceedings carried a deeper, more personal weight. Sarah sat at the defendant's table looking far older than her 51 years. 16 years of isolation and guilt had transformed the vibrant schoolteacher who had once been beloved by her students into a frail, hollow-eyed woman who seemed to have aged decades in the months since Daniel's rescue. Her attorney, Margaret Chen, had built the defense around diminished capacity and extreme psychological duress. Sarah's mental health evaluation revealed severe depression, anxiety disorders, and what psychiatrists termed shared delusional disorder, where she had become completely convinced of supernatural threats that existed only in her mind. "My client is not a monster," Chen told the jury during opening statements. "She is a mother who became so terrified for her son's safety and the safety of others that she made the tragic decision to isolate him from the world. This was not cruelty but misguided love taken to a devastating extreme." The prosecution, led by District Attorney Robert Harrison, painted a different picture. They argued that regardless of Sarah's motivations, she had committed child abuse on an unprecedented scale, robbing Daniel of his fundamental human rights for most of his life. The defendant chained her own son to a wall for 16 years, Harrison told the jury. She denied him education, socialization, medical care, and basic human dignity. No belief system, no matter how sincere, can justify such treatment of another human being. The most compelling testimony came from Daniel himself, now 23 and showing remarkable progress in his rehabilitation. He took the stand wearing clothes that still seemed foreign to him and speaking in the formal, measured tone that had developed during his years of isolation. "I want everyone to understand that my mother loves me," he said, looking directly at the jury. "Everything she did, she believed was necessary to protect me and protect others from the things that happened around me." Daniel's testimony was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. He described 16 years of captivity without bitterness or anger, explaining the supernatural phenomena that had convinced his parents he was dangerous. He spoke about his mother's daily care for him, how she had treated his injuries and tried to make his confinement as comfortable as possible. "She would sit outside my door and read to me sometimes," Daniel said, his voice never wavering, despite the obvious emotion behind his words. "She taught me mathematics by having me solve problems through the door. She never stopped being my mother, even when she was also my jailer." But perhaps the most devastating testimony came from the community members who had known the family before their disappearance. Margaret Foster from the daycare spoke about the unusual incidents surrounding young Daniel and her conversation with his parents. Pastor Reynolds reluctantly admitted that he had essentially given up on helping the family when their problems exceeded his theological understanding. "We all failed that little boy," said Elizabeth Martinez, a neighbor from their old Pine Ridge home. "We knew something was wrong, but we convinced ourselves it wasn't our business. We let a family disappear without fighting for them." Dr. Michael Torres provided scientific context for the supernatural phenomena that had driven the family's tragic decisions. His testimony about the electromagnetic fields and geological anomalies offered rational explanations for events that the Hartwells had interpreted as demonic. The defendant and her family were living above what essentially amounts to a natural electromagnetic generator, Torres explained to the jury. The phenomena they experienced were real, but they weren't supernatural. They were geological. The psychiatric testimony revealed the extent of Sarah's mental deterioration during the years of isolation. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had been treating Sarah since her arrest, described a woman who had lost touch with reality to such a degree that she still believed Daniel posed a supernatural threat to others. Mrs. Hartwell suffers from severe delusional disorder exacerbated by decades of social isolation, Dr. Foster testified. She genuinely believes that releasing Daniel into society would result in harm to innocent people. In her mind, keeping him chained was an act of protection, not cruelty. When Sarah finally took the stand in her own defense, her testimony was both tragic and disturbing. She spoke in disconnected fragments about the voices she heard, the spirits she believed inhabited their mountain property, and her continuing fear that Daniel's freedom would bring disaster to the community. "I know everyone thinks I'm crazy," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I've seen what he can do. I've seen the things that follow him. I kept him safe, and I kept everyone else safe. That's what mothers do." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning with a verdict of guilty on charges of child endangerment and unlawful imprisonment. But they also recommended psychiatric treatment rather than prison time, acknowledging the complex circumstances that had led to Daniel's captivity. Dr. Amanda Foster had specialized in trauma rehabilitation for 12 years, but Daniel Hartwell represented the most challenging case of her career. When he first arrived at the Mountain View Rehabilitation Center 6 months after his rescue, he moved through the world with the careful deliberation of someone who had forgotten how to navigate free space. The first thing we had to address was his physical conditioning, Dr. Foster explained to her colleagues during a case review. 16 years of limited movement had left him barely able to walk more than a few yards without exhaustion. The physical therapy sessions were both inspiring and heartbreaking to observe. Daniel approached each exercise with the same quiet determination he had shown during his captivity, never complaining about pain or fatigue. But his therapists could see the wonder in his eyes as he gradually regained strength and mobility. "Look, Dr. Foster," he had said during his 3rd week of treatment, managing to walk the entire length of the therapy room without assistance. "My legs remember how to carry me." Perhaps more challenging than the physical rehabilitation was teaching Daniel the basic skills of modern life. He had never used a telephone, operated a television remote control, or even turned on a light switch. The simple act of choosing what to eat from a menu overwhelmed him initially, as he had lived for 16 years on whatever meals his parents provided. "We had to start with the most fundamental concepts," explained occupational therapist Lisa Chen. "How to use a doorknob, how to operate a shower, how to select clothing appropriate for different weather. Things that most people learn as toddlers. But Daniel's remarkable intelligence and adaptability made him an exceptional student. Within weeks, he was mastering technologies that should have taken months to understand. His formal, bookish vocabulary gradually relaxed into more natural speech patterns as he interacted with staff and other patients. The psychological aspects of his rehabilitation proved more complex. Daniel showed no signs of the anger or resentment that Dr. Foster typically expected from abuse survivors. Instead, he displayed an almost supernatural level of forgiveness and understanding toward his parents. "I don't blame them for what they did," he explained during one of their therapy sessions. "They were as trapped by fear as I was by chains. Fear makes people do things they never thought they were capable of." But Daniel did struggle with concepts of personal autonomy and decision-making. After 16 years of having every aspect of his life controlled by others, the simple act of choosing what to wear or what to eat often paralyzed him with indecision. He would stand in front of his closet for 20 minutes trying to decide between 2 shirts, noted his residential counselor, Mark Rodriguez. The freedom to choose was actually more frightening to him initially than the lack of choice had been. Social interaction presented another significant challenge. Daniel had never learned the casual rhythms of conversation, the subtle social cues that govern human relationships. His interactions with others were formal and earnest, lacking the casual banter that comes naturally to most people. He spoke to everyone like he was delivering a prepared speech, Dr. Foster observed. But gradually, as he spent more time around the staff and other patients, he began to understand the more relaxed aspects of human communication. The breakthrough moment in Daniel's rehabilitation came during his 4th month at the center, when he experienced his first genuine laugh. A therapy dog named Buster had knocked over a chair while chasing a tennis ball, and Daniel had burst into spontaneous laughter at the sight. It was the first time any of us had heard him make a sound of pure joy, Dr. Foster noted in her records. You could see something unlock in his face, as if he was remembering what happiness felt like. Daniel's progress accelerated rapidly after that moment. He began participating in group therapy sessions, sharing his experiences with other trauma survivors. His unique perspective and remarkable resilience made him an inspiring presence for patients dealing with their own recovery challenges. Daniel taught us all about the power of forgiveness, said fellow patient Rebecca Torres, who had been recovering from domestic violence. If he could forgive his parents after what they put him through, maybe I could find a way to forgive too. By his 6th month at the center, Daniel had mastered most basic life skills and was ready to begin exploring possibilities for his future. He showed particular interest in art therapy, creating sculptures and paintings that reflected his years of isolation, while also expressing his growing hope for the future. I want to learn everything, he told Dr. Foster during one of their final sessions. I've spent so many years in one small room, and now the whole world is available to me. I want to see birds in flight, watch the sunset over different mountains, meet people from places I've only imagined. The staff at Mountain View had rarely seen a patient embrace their recovery with such enthusiasm and grace. Daniel's rehabilitation became a testament to the human spirit's capacity to heal and grow. Even after the most extreme circumstances, Daniel Hartwell stood at the window of his small apartment, watching the sunrise paint the Pine Ridge Mountains in shades of gold and pink. 2 years had passed since his rescue from the remote cabin, and he was finally living independently for the first time in his 25 years of life. The apartment was modest, but filled with symbols of his newfound freedom. Bookshelves lined the walls, heavy with volumes he was systematically reading to fill the gaps in his unconventional education. His carved wooden birds, rescued from the cabin during the investigation, perched on every available surface, no longer representing dreams of flight, but celebrating the reality of liberation. On his kitchen table lay the letter he had been writing for weeks, addressed to the Pine Ridge community. After months of preparation with Dr. Foster, he felt ready to share his story in his own words, to offer forgiveness where others might harbor resentment. To the people of Pine Ridge, the letter began. My name is Daniel Hartwell, and I am the son who disappeared with his family 23 years ago. I'm writing to you now as a free man, grateful for the life I have been given and hopeful for the future that stretches ahead of me. The letter went on to describe his experiences with remarkable candor and grace. He wrote about his parents' love, twisted though it had become by fear and superstition. He acknowledged the community's collective failure to intervene when his family began to withdraw from society. But he did so without judgment or anger. I have learned that fear makes people do extraordinary things, both terrible and wonderful, he wrote. My parents' fear led them to chain me for 16 years. But your fear of getting involved, of prying into private matters, was also understandable. We are all human, all imperfect, all struggling to do what we believe is right. Since his release from the rehabilitation center, Daniel had been working part-time at the Pine Ridge Library, helping to catalog and preserve historical documents. The work suited him perfectly, combining his love of learning with his careful, methodical nature. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had become something of a surrogate grandmother to him, patiently teaching him the social graces he had missed during his years of isolation. Daniel, has become the heart of our library, she often told visitors. Children love listening to him read stories, and adults are amazed by his insights into the books he's discovered. He approaches literature like an explorer mapping new territory, but perhaps Daniel's most meaningful relationships had developed with other trauma survivors. He volunteered at the Mountain View Rehabilitation Center twice a week, sharing his story and offering hope to patients who felt overwhelmed by their own recovery journeys. Healing is not about forgetting the past, he would tell them. It's about choosing how that past will shape your future. We can let our experiences make us bitter, or we can let them make us wise. Sarah Hartwell remained in a psychiatric facility, her condition gradually stabilizing under professional care. Daniel visited her monthly, despite the painful nature of these encounters. His mother still struggled to distinguish reality from her delusions. But she had moments of clarity when she could see the remarkable man her son had become. "I'm so sorry, Daniel," she had said during their most recent visit. "I thought I was protecting you, but I stole your childhood instead." "You gave me life, Mama," Daniel had replied, taking her frail hand in his. "And now I'm living it fully. That's what matters." Pastor Reynolds had resigned from the Pine Ridge Baptist Church shortly after the trial, unable to reconcile his failure to help the Hartwell family with his calling to serve others. But he and Daniel had developed an unlikely friendship, meeting monthly for conversations about faith, forgiveness, and the mysteries of human nature. "You've taught me more about Christianity than 40 years of ministry," Reynolds had told him. "Your capacity for forgiveness is something I'm still trying to understand." As Daniel finished his letter to the community, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a chained prisoner to a free man contributing to society. The supernatural phenomena that had terrorized his family had ceased entirely once he left the electromagnetic field of their mountain property. But the wisdom he had gained during those dark years remained with him, informing every decision and relationship in his new life. "I do not write seeking your pity or even your understanding," his letter concluded. "I write to offer my gratitude for the second chance at life that your community has given me. I write to promise that I will spend my remaining years trying to be worthy of the freedom I have been granted. And I write to remind you that no matter how dark circumstances may seem, there is always hope for healing, always possibility for redemption, always reason to believe that love will eventually overcome fear." The morning sun had fully risen by the time Daniel sealed the letter in its envelope. Outside his window, birds were beginning their daily songs, and somewhere in the distance he could hear children laughing as they walked to school. These were the sounds of a world he had finally joined, a world where chains existed only in memory, and freedom was no longer just a dream carved in wood.